My name is Dr. Edward.burke. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham. I'm very grateful to Donegal County Council and the Library Service for inviting me to give this lecture. The title of my lecture is Closing the Gates, Loyalist Paramilitaries and Resistance in Donegal during the Anglo-Irish War and the Civil War. This research has been made possible due to a fellowship I currently hold from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Donegal had a relatively quiet revolution during 1919 to 1921, ranking in the mid-range of Ulster counties for violence. T.K. Wilson, the historian, describes the low levels of IRA violence in the county as counterintuitive, considering Donegal's experience of agrarian outrage during the Land War of the 1870s. This view is contested by Okan Oseker, who observes that despite such famous or infamous incidents such as the murder of the Earl of Leitrim in Donegal in 1878, Donegal experienced lower than average rates of agrarian crime compared to the rest of the country. According to Oseker, Fenian activities were also relatively muted. Low levels of IRA radicalism during 1919 to 1921 were more of a continuum, therefore, than an aberration. Moreover, some of the disturbed rural areas in Donegal voted for an Irish Parliamentary Party candidate rather than Sinn Féin in 1918. In this paper, I argue that Protestant or Loyalist deterrent violence was much more limited than that seen in Monaghan. The reasons for this are varied. First, low levels of IRA activity from 1919 to 1921 self-evidently required a lower response. Second, the death of critical Ulster Volunteer Force UVF leaders during the First World War, those who made up its non-commissioned officer class before the war, impacted upon the morale of and potential for resistance. Third, the county's UVF leaders had a conflict of interest, being connected both to Loyalists in Donegal but also to the defence of the city of Derry. They chose to concentrate their energies and resources towards the latter and the emerging Northern Ireland. Fourth, the most dangerous period for Loyalists was after the British withdrawal. This resulted in a successful de facto alliance with pro-treaty forces to curb the threat from the anti-treaty IRA. The exception to this was in Pettigo, where Loyalists maintained open, sometimes violent resistance to the Free State until the beginning of 1923. Although Donegal is the fourth largest Irish county, only the east of the county had a sizable Protestant population. Overall, just under 21% of Donegal's population belonged to Protestant denominations in 1911. In 1911, Anglicans outnumbered Presbyterians, while only 1,631 residents identified as Methodists. Approximately half of Donegal's Protestant population, a little over 30,000, were concentrated in the old East Donegal constituency. In the old Londonderry No. 2 district, which administered parts of Donegal near the city, the numbers of Catholics and Protestants were closely matched. In the former Strabane No. 2 district, areas in Donegal in places like Raphoe, Ernie West and St Johnston, the population was also closely divided between those who identified as nationalist or unionist. Areas of Protestant strength, such as around Raphoe, were separated from the 6 counties of Northern Ireland by districts in which Catholics had a clear majority, later complicating efforts by Donegal's Loyalists to win a realignment of the border in their favour. Southwards, small areas of Protestant strength endured in districts like Pettigo and Cliff, near the banks of Lower Lough Erne. Donegal was, of course, a predominantly rural county. Only 5% of the population lived in urban areas in towns such as Letterkenny, Raphoe and Bundoran. The key market for many Donegal products was the city of Derry. A reputation for liberalism and relative intercommunal tolerance did not prevent Donegal's Protestants from enthusiastically embracing the wider Ulster movement. Large numbers of Loyalists volunteered for service in the UVF. A lingering fear among Donegal Loyalists that the counties with Protestant majorities elsewhere in Ulster might jettison those in West and South Ulster who had much smaller Protestant populations was readily dismissed by leading unionists in the county. Donegal was represented on the Ulster Unionist Council by the Earl of Leitrim and James Clark, the latter a large farmer, merchant and master of Raphoe Loyal Orange Lodge. Union Jacks, bunting and cheering crowds of Loyalists greeted Edward Carson during his visit to Raphoe in the autumn of 1913. The senior officer corps of the Donegal UVF was drawn from the county's gentry and upper middle classes. The regiment was split into 3 and later 5 battalions. concentrated in those traditional areas of Protestant strength. In June 1914, 1st Battalion of the Donegal Regiment of the UVF was commanded by Major James Miles, a magistrate, a former Irish rugby international, and the son of a prominent Ballyshannon hardware merchant. And the 1st Battalion largely recruited from the south of the county. 2nd Battalion was headquartered in Raphoe and led by Major John Bailey, a land agent to E.C. Herdman and a former officer and honorary Lieutenant Colonel of the Prince of Wales Donegal Artillery. The 3rd Battalion area, which also included the Northwest Liberties, that narrow rural area in County Londonderry on the west bank of the Foyle, was led by Major Robert Lyon Moore of Cliff House in County Donegal. And of course, he was also of the same family that owned the Mullinan estate in the Liberties in County Londonderry. 4th Battalion, centred on Ramelton in the north of the county, was commanded by John Osborne, a solicitor in the town. Finally, 5th Battalion in Inishowen was commanded by Major John Pine Coffin, an English professional soldier with family ties to the city of Derry and Donegal. Company commanders tended to be large farmers, often from leading Orange families. The company was also formed at the Royal School in Raphoe. As elsewhere in Ulster, the Donegal UVF drew upon a number of ex-servicemen to drill Ulster volunteers. Younger, more dynamic UVF leaders emerged from outside the traditional aristocratic or patrician elites during the course of 1913 and 1914. Among them was Henry Gallagher, the captain of the Cunningham UVF. Gallagher was the son of a large farmer and local councillor. His father later described how his family's whole political outlook and ethos, quote, was imbued with feelings of loyalty to Victoria the Good and King Edward the Peacemaker, unquote. David Bates formed a company near Castlefin. Bates had served in the Imperial Yeomanry before later joining the North Irish Horse. His father, a large farmer, was a councillor on Strabane No. 2 Council. In 1911, James Freeborn Ray lied about his age to join the North Irish Horse Militia, and later, at the age of 20, was the driving force behind the recruitment, mobilisation and training of the UVF in his local area in South Donegal. Another exceptionally active UVF captain was William Wagentreiber, who commanded the Lifford and Ballindrake Company of the UVF, as well as acting as a motorcycle dispatch rider and signals officer. Willie Wag, as he was called, was the son of a clergyman and later married James Clark's daughter and became a partner in his father-in-law's bottling company. The outbreak of war in 1914 saw simultaneous British Army recruiting efforts by the UVF and the National Volunteers, which led to scenes of occasional mingling and fraternisation. Recruiting in counties such as Donegal, with predominantly rural populations, tended to be lower. Livestock could not be abandoned, the land had to be cultivated. Moreover, Loyalists remained concerned at the potential for political or agrarian unrest in the county, telling the Royal Irish Constabulary that if they go to the front, they will leave their property unprotected. These Loyalist fears were later corroborated by leading Republicans. In 1918, J.P. McGinley gave a speech in Letterkenny where he urged his audience to resist the threat of conscription, adding that, quote, the Unionists and Ulster Volunteers are all well armed. Go out and collect these arms and we shall resist this threat at the point of the rifle. Despite such misgivings, young UVF officers like Gallagher, Bates, Ray and Wagentreiber were among the first to volunteer to join 11th Battalion Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, which had been formed from the Donegal and Fermanagh UVF regiments. The First World War had a profound effect on the most active subaltern ranks of the UVF in Donegal. Pockets of more active Loyalist militancy had emerged in the county by the outbreak of the First World War. One such place was the district of Burt, 6 miles from the walls of Derry, which had a large Protestant population, approximately 50% overall, and a quarter of Burt defenders, Loyal Orange Lodge, volunteered for military service. The Buchanan family of Inch was at the heart of the Burt UVF platoon, and indeed 6 of the 7 Buchanan brothers served in the First World War. Henry Gallagher was perhaps the most gifted soldier among the young officers of the Donegal UVF. He was killed on 7th June 1917 while in command of B Company, 11th Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, during the attack of Messine Ridge on the Western Front. Other Donegal UVF company commanders or junior officers who served in the First World War survived, but many of these chose not to return to their native county. Captain William Wagentreiber did return to Donegal. He was badly wounded at the Somme, but later recovered and commanded C Company of the 11th Battalion Royal Enniskilling Fusiliers at the Battle of Cambrai in 1918. Meanwhile, the former Donegal UVF battalion commanders also returned home. Men such as Major Miles, who had been seriously wounded at the Somme and awarded the Military Cross. He rejoined his father's business in Ballyshannon. Major Robert Moore, who had served in the Tank Corps, took up residence in Cliff House, a few miles from the Fermanagh town of Balleek, but on the Donegal side. After the war, the overall commander of the UVF in Donegal, Lord Leitrim, who had initially commanded 11th Battalion Royal Enniskilling Fusiliers, but resigned due to ill health, made frequent trips to his estates in Donegal from his home in London. The events of 1914 to 1918, including, of course, the Easter Rising of 1916, the conscription crisis of 1918, energised armed nationalism in Donegal. The opposite was true for the Donegal UVF and Loyalism, which lost some of its most capable leaders. Lord Leitrim was also appalled at the proposed exclusion of the three counties, which had been mooted during the First World War, seeing it as a stab in the back to those three counties Loyalists fighting in France. This, of course, was effectively what Ulster Unionists in Donegal regarded as the partition of the province, and the jettisoning or the betrayal of the three counties by placing them under the jurisdiction of a future Southern Irish administration based in Dublin. Nonetheless, Donegal in 1918 was one of the few nationalist majority constituencies that Sinn Féin could not win. When Eamon de Valera attempted to hold a meeting in Raphoe in early 1917, he and his supporters were attacked by Loyalists. The meeting was initially abandoned, but later reconvened in order to send a signal of defiant intent to the Loyalist population. Shots were fired by Loyalists during fighting between rival factions. Major Robert Moore, the Unionist candidate in East Donegal for the 1918 UK general election, campaigned widely across the constituency and polled just under 5,000 votes, although of course he lost out to the Irish Parliamentary Party candidate. Loyalists were fortunate that the IPP remained so durable in East Donegal. Elsewhere, the 1918 campaign was a catalyst for the development and mobilisation of a Sinn Féin network that provided the political and financial scaffolding for the IRA's armed campaign. But despite less intense levels of IRA activity in the east of the county, the relative absence of Loyalist armed defence organisations compared to those seen in Monaghan, another county betrayed by the Ulster Unionist Council, deserves more attention. As already seen, lower levels of IRA activity meant that the situation for Loyalists was less grave, at least in East Donegal. The patrician or aristocratic leaders of Unionism and UVF in the county also quickly resigned themselves to the prospect of Donegal being excluded from a future Northern Ireland, particularly after that removal of Donegal together with Cavan and Monaghan from the Ulster Unionist Council on the 10th of March 1920. Lord Leitrim, for example, does not seem to have made any concerted attempt to lobby the new Northern Irish government in Belfast or the government in London on behalf of Donegal's Loyalists in the early 1920s. However, as IRA leader in North Donegal, Neil Blaney discovered, Lord Leitrim had other concerns, namely the defence of Londonderry, where he served as Lord Lieutenant. Major Robert Moore, the former commanding officer of 3rd Battalion Donegal UVF, also had strong connections with Derry. His father owned an estate just outside the city, and he himself later served as Grand Master of the Orange Order there. During the early morning of 3rd of October 1920, Neil Blaney, the IRA commander for the Fana Peninsula and much of the surrounding area of North Donegal, carried out a raid on Lord Leitrim's home, Mulroy Castle, in order to capture a large amount of what he believed to be a large amount of UVF arms that were stored there. Mulroy had been a centre of UVF activity in 1913 and 1914, particularly for the 2nd Battalion of the UVF, which at one point included men like Henry Gallagher and his Manor Cunningham Company. Blaney's men rowed from the Fanad side of Mulroy Bay to the shores of the castle before surprising Lord Leitrim's staff and gaining entry. Leitrim himself was in London. The arms, however, were already gone. Blaney reported that these had been, quote unquote, sent to be used in the Derry riots of June 1920. Although the city of Derry had a majority Catholic population by late 19th, the early 20th century, Londonderry remained a spiritual and vital centre of loyalism in West Ulster. The sudden escalation of sectarian rioting in the city in late spring and early summer of 1920 presented a grave threat to the Loyalist position in the city. There were a few troops in Derry at the time, approximately 250 soldiers, mostly drawn from the Dorsetshire Regiment. By April 1920, there was a rising sense of panic among the city's unionist population about a nationalist takeover. On 19th of June, Loyalists went on the attack in the city. A week of sustained violence broke out. Shots were exchanged between Loyalist and nationalist snipers, and sectarian murders were carried out. 20 people were killed, and many more were wounded. The firepower of the IRA in Derry in late June proved no match for that of the UVF. The Loyalist plan of attack on 19th of June included seizing prominent buildings in the city overlooking nationalist controlled areas, or those indeed heavily infiltrated by the IRA. During this period, Loyalist snipers also fired into districts they believed were controlled by Republicans, saying that they were simply trying to disperse crowds, but of course they killed a number of civilians in the process, and they wounded many more. These controversial actions were then followed up by UVF patrols openly carrying revolvers and indeed ambushes on IRA volunteers trying to leave or enter the city. The military and the Royal Irish Constabulary did little to stop the UVF. Having taken control of large parts of the city, UVF snipers and patrols were able to disperse by the end of the month. British Army reinforcements had arrived, there were now more than 1,500 soldiers in and around the city. IRA activities fell off sharply in Derry after this. Indeed, Ozaker notes that the IRA lacked support within the city and the means to take on the British Army and the UVF after this period, and that its leaders effectively agreed to a truce and indeed took part in a conciliation and protection committee together with local loyalists. The whole episode, according to Ozaker, represented a defeat of sorts for the IRA. As in previous generations, Donegal loyalists came to Derry to join in the fight. The importance of such assistance was recalled by the city's political leaders in the mid-1930s when leading unionists in the city reminded Sir James Craig's government of its debt to Donegal. One leading unionist said that Donegal men had, quote, given faithful service and they were reliable. They are an honourable set of men. Where would Derry have been in 1920, the year of the riots, without them? A focus then on protecting Derry, particularly including sending men and arms, would certainly have impacted upon proposals or preparations for Donegal Loyalists' own defence. Nonetheless, the Donegal Democrat was convinced that Loyalists were mobilising to help the RIC and the British Army to crack down the IRA, mostly with respect to passing on intelligence. A lack of arms on the part of the IRA meant that confrontation with Loyalists suspected of harbouring large amounts of UVF arms was inevitable. In North Donegal, in western parts of the Lagan, and in the Fahan Peninsula, resistance was encountered as early as February 1920 when some of the first raids took place. Arms yields were disappointingly low during raids in areas such as Kilmacrennan and Convoy. Some exchanges of fire with Loyalists did take place, but the IRA suffered no fatalities. Even in areas where Loyalists were more isolated, such as the Malin Peninsula, raids were often risky affairs. Exchanges of fire between IRA raiding parties and Loyalists were quite frequent. A few raids in North Donegal were successful. Neil Blaney's more active battalion, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Brigade, 1st Division, in the Fannet area, carried out successive sweeps of their area for UVF arms. The Loyalist population here tended to be smaller and more dispersed than in the east of the county. IRA raids for Loyalist arms in the Lagan appear to have been more infrequent during 1920 and 1921. Indeed, much of the area was relatively peaceful compared to elsewhere in the county. The RIC had already also confiscated some of the 2nd Battalion UVF, the area around Rafo, its arms, and indeed one RIC sweep for arms had netted 27 UVF rifles and 7,000 rounds of ammunition at the Royal School in Rafo. The potential scale of resistance in areas like the Lagan, with its concentrated population of Loyalists, made raiding a potentially more hazardous enterprise for the IRA. Thomas Coyle, the captain of the IRA's White Cross Company, stressed the difficulties of operating in, quote, one of the most difficult orange districts in East Donegal. However, he and his men did secure some arms and ammunition in raids on the houses of Loyalists. Coyle also stated that we, quote, we, the IRA and the Lagan, considered the Ulster Volunteers one of our bitterest elements at the time, and we were fired up on them many times. Charles Holmes, the captain of Dromochil Company near Nottingham, also gave evidence of the widespread and active hostility of Loyalists towards the IRA in the Lagan area. Far from being cowed by IRA claims of victory, the day after the truce of 11th of July 1921, the Orangemen of Burt in full regalia marched 8 miles over the Lagan Hills to join their county brethren at Carrigans. There are a number of contributing factors why the Lagan was relatively quiet during 1919 to 1921, including a less proactive, fractured and effective IRA leadership in places, the strength of the ancient order of Hibernians and the Irish Parliamentary Party, a more antipathetic attitude by local Catholic clergy, and a fear of attritional intercommunal conflict with local Protestants or Loyalists. Loyalists in the Lagan may also have been fortunate in that the RIC District Inspector in Letterkenny, Patrick Walsh, was in secret contact with leading Republicans in the area, including warning them of military sweeps or roundups. The Free State government later appointed Walsh as Assistant Commissioner in An Garda Síochána. However, former Monaghan IRA leader James McKenna, who also served as a senior Garda officer, remained deeply sceptical about Walsh's loyalties before 1922. Walsh was also from Monaghan. Leading IRA volunteers from the period also believed that he may have self-servingly played both sides. As District Inspector for much of the Lagan area, Walsh's communications with IRA leaders may have been instrumental in directing or perhaps even limiting IRA activity, including against local inhabitants. In the autumn of 1920, the South Donegal IRA began a series of coordinated raids aimed at subduing the local population in their area and seizing their arms. Exchanges of fire frequently took place and several IRA volunteers were wounded. The most active and enduring Loyalist resistance to the IRA in South Donegal was in the village and surrounding area of Pettigo. Uniquely in Donegal, Pettigo was part of the Fermanagh UVF regiment. A third of the village is in that county, and indeed the most prominent family in the area, the Bartons, lived at Waterfoot, which was also in County Fermanagh. In 1914, Pettigo UVF district mustered 187 Ulster volunteers, more than the neighbouring Fermanagh district of Irvinstown. In 1911, Pettigo district's population was just over 1,000, of whom a small majority were Protestant. 400 people lived in the village itself, which was regarded as a Loyalist village, and the rest in the surrounding rural area. In 1920, Pettigo's Loyalists went on the offensive. In October, Loyalists attacked Daniel McGrath's house on Mill Street, firing shots through the windows. Loyalist gunmen then went on to shoot up the premises of a Catholic publican in the village. Both men were known to the RIC as Sinn Féin supporters. The IRA also suffered a serious setback when one of the Ellis brothers, Henry, Robert and James, local farmers who lived in the townland of Gaeltacht, shot and wounded Danny Gallagher. Gallagher was the leading IRA commander for the area and was effectively out of action for several months before resuming command of his battalion in 1921. In April and May 1921, the Pettigo IRA reported that they were ambushed while enforcing a ruling of a Republican court at a farm outside the village. A report signed by an IRA officer, Thomas McShay, blamed local specials who were operating in Pettigo. Ulster Specials being, of course, Ulster Special Constabulary, which had been established in late 1920 with the support of the new incoming, or the nascent Northern Irish administration. Outside of Pettigo, Loyalists' armed engagements with the IRA seem to have been predominantly defensive, mostly individual farmers who took up arms to prevent raids on their property. The negotiation of the truce then between the British government and the IRA commencing in July 1921 came as relief to much of the IRA in Donegal. But for Loyalists in South Donegal and in East Donegal, the worst was still to come. Speaking to Donegal's leading Orangemen in the summer of 1921, Major Robert Moore warned of dark days ahead. By agreeing to the truce, the British government had already capitulated, he said, to murder. Moore warned that the Loyalists of Donegal, men who had fought with him in France, that, quote, if necessary, they would have to shoulder their guns again. Hope was in short supply among Donegal's Loyalists for much of the early part of 1922. A renewed IRA campaign against Loyalists in the county began in February, barely 2 months after the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Robert Moore was now in command of the Ulster Sea Specials in West Ulster, based in Londonderry. These were an unpaid plainclothes reserve of men armed mostly with revolvers, although he continued to live across the new border in Donegal in his house at Cliff near Ballyshannon. In response to the detention of the Monaghan footballers, IRA volunteers who had been detained by the police on their way to Derry in disputed circumstances, the IRA decided to kidnap Moore and a number of other prominent Donegal loyalists who lived close to the border on the nights of 7th to 8th of February. Moore escaped, slamming the door on his would-be kidnappers, who ran out the back of his house, following the nearby railway track until he reached the safety of the military barracks in Balleek. William Hamilton of Ballintraw and Major Miles were kidnapped on the same night, together with Blacker Douglas from Kinloch in nearby County Leitrim, and these men were held for more than 2 weeks until the release of the Monaghan IRA volunteers. In the north of the county, Neil Blaney organised a series of raids in or near the town of Milford on the night of 11th February. Milford was well chosen since it was the residence of John Osborne, a local solicitor who had taken over the leadership of the UVF after the departure of Lord Leitrim to the front in 1914. Blaney's men netted 18 rifles and 3,000 rounds of ammunition. Resistance to the raiders came not from the local UVF, but perhaps more unexpectedly from 68-year-old John Huddleston, a retired colonial forestry officer and former Ceylon tea planter, who shot and mortally wounded Joseph Duffy. Duffy was the captain of the IRA's Milford Company. On 23rd of February, Charles Burns, the son of a grocer who had served in France with the North Irish Horse, was shot dead in Milford. A local IRA volunteer claimed that, Michael Cull claimed that Charles Burns and his brother, a member of the UVF, forced their way past an IRA picket on a boycotted shop, Alcorns in Milford, and, quote, became abusive. Cull and 3 other IRA volunteers then went for the 2 brothers. Charles Burns drew a revolver and was shot dead. An inquest later ruled that Burns was lawfully killed. Increased pressure on the anti-treaty IRA across the border meant that a number of Tyrone and Derry IRA volunteers moved to base themselves in Donegal during the early months of 1922. Experienced volunteers from Cork and Kerry also moved into Donegal and began to assume key leadership positions, particularly among those units that were against the treaty. Although the majority of Donegal's IRA volunteers were pro-treaty, the leadership of capable Munster guerrillas such as Sean Lehan and Charlie Daly, combined with the steady flow of recruits from across the border, energised what was to become the irregular forces on the anti-treaty side of the 1922-1923 Civil War. Even before the Civil War began, irregular forces were already moving into and occupying key positions in Loyalist districts, such as Orange Halls in Carrigan, St Johnston, Lifford, and the Masonic Lodge in Raphoe, the Masonic Lodge in Raphoe becoming effectively a type of headquarters for the anti-treaty IRA in northwest Ulster. During May and June 1922, policing broke down in much of East and South Donegal. The withdrawal of the British Army and the disbandment of the RIC left a gap which the new institutions of the provisional government, what became the Free State, were not able or willing to fill. Anti-treaty IRA units and the emerging National Army were predominantly focused on preparing for the Northern Offensive that came in May of that year. IRA raids and violence against Loyalists spiked in the first half of 1922 in the lead up to the IRA's border or Northern Offensive. At the Boundary Commission hearings in 1924, a member of the delegation of Donegal Loyalists observed that all of those present, except one, had, quote, suffered severely by looting and by damage to property during the Civil War, even if they primarily blamed IRA volunteers from the south of the country rather than their Catholic neighbours. Did Loyalists retaliate or take defensive measures against IRA activity in East Donegal during the Civil War? Curiously, in East Donegal, an area which had done much for the Loyalist position in Londonderry in June 1920, there are very few examples of Loyalist resistance or retribution. Only Ballintraw and Pettigo in South Donegal mustered any organised resistance during 1922. At the end of May, Brigadier General Joseph Murray, commander of 4th Brigade, 1st Division of the new National Army, reported on his concerns that a Loyalist paramilitary network was operating in the Ballintraw area. On the night of 26th of May 1922, 4 Brigade's medical officer James Griffin was fired on while driving past the village's Union Hall. The bullet pierced the windscreen, just missing Griffin. Murray ordered the local battalion to conduct a thorough search of the area in order to disarm and subdue Ballintrol's specials, again purported to belong to basically Ulster Special Constabulary, but somehow across the 6 counties and operating in wider Ulster. Murray also ordered them to obtain information on who had shot at his officer. Murray increased patrols, and there were no more reports of specials in Ballintrol. Such loyalist vigilante patrols may have been organised to discourage banditry or irregular activity in the area, rather than trying to completely exclude the National Army. On 27th of January 1922, Loyalists in Pettigo attacked and beat up 5 local Catholics. National Army reports, later seized by the British Army after the capture of Pettigo in June of that year, also revealed mounting tensions between Irish soldiers and local loyalists, including one complaint by an Irish officer of the new National Army that the brigade captain of signals was, quote, under the influence of drink and was encouraging disputes between members of the army and the civil population. The offending officer, Captain Thomas Steele, was arrested twice for abusive behaviour, including being insubordinate to the commanding officer of the local battalion. Steele also appears to have been demoted as a consequence. He was listed as a sergeant in the National Army census later that year. Steele was a local man who had served in the IRA's Pettigo Company, but his family lived just across the border in County Fermanagh. His conflict with Pettigo's loyalists was therefore very local, born out of grudges and animosity. He was not alone. By May 1922, 35 IRA volunteers from the 6 counties had moved to Pettigo with accounts of harassment and abuses that had been perpetrated against them and their families by the Ulster Special Constabulary. The IRA headquarters in Pettigo was on Mill Street, just south of the bridge over the Termon River that divided Donegal and Fermanagh in Northern Ireland from the new Irish state. In the weeks after the Anglo-Irish Treaty, there was little, if any, police presence along the northwestern shore of Lough Erne between Balleek and Pettigo. In the spring of 1922, the IRA moved in, effectively taking control of the town of Balleek and much of the surrounding area. An important supporter of the IRA in the area was Father Lorcan O'Kieran, who was the parish priest of Pettigo and who lived at Maharamina Castle just outside Balleek. Meanwhile, tensions in Pettigo continued to rise during April and early May and across the border in the Protestant majority area of Kesh, where local specials prepared for renewed IRA attacks in the area. According to the National Army, the Ulster Special Constabulary mounted a machine gun a few yards from the main bridge in Pettigo, training it on Irish soldiers a few yards away on a daily basis. The joint National Army anti-treaty IRA Northern Offensive began on 19th of May 1922. On 26th of May, Brigadier Joseph Murray wrote a report on Ulster Special Constabulary activity in the Free State. The National Army had seized 2 rifles, quote, from specials who reside in County Donegal, unquote. Murray warned that a number of loyalists were in the Pettigo area were actively resisting the National Army. On 28th of May, IRA and National Army reinforcements moved into the Pettigo area, digging trenches and erecting barriers of railway sleepers around the village. On 31st of May, Brigadier Murray reported that his men had seized more UVF weapons in Pettigo, including 3 rifles and the same number of revolvers. During the following days, there seems to be some description, sort of interchangeable descriptions between UVF and specials. So it's hard to know whether, to what extent some suspects are actually simply, former members of the UVF are actually possibly serving members of specials. There does seem to have been a handful of individuals in Pettigo who did continue to serve in the specials until up to around the truce time. During the following days, the National Army and IRA commanders moved quickly to arrest prominent loyalists who resided on the Donegal side of Pettigo. As well as removing suspected armed opponents, such individuals could be used to deter future Ulster Special Constabulary reprisals against Republican families in the north or to secure an exchange of prisoners. Among those loyalists arrested by the IRA was the former head constable for the USC in Pettigo, William Murphy. Murphy worked as a chemist and resided on the Donegal side of the border. A veteran, he had served as an officer in the 11th Battalion Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers in France. And he later recalled that, quote, he did not know how he had offended. He belonged to the B Force and was an ex-serviceman, but he was well treated by his captors, the IRA. Evidently, Murphy believed, or at least pretended to believe, that it should be possible to loyally serve in a British or imperial institution like the USC, while also continuing to reside as a law-abiding citizen in County Donegal. Murray and 3 other Donegal members, or former members of the Ulster Special Constabulary, were imprisoned until August, including at Ballyshannon, Drumbo, and later Glenties. The Anglican rector of Pettigo, Reverend Edgar McKegney, confirmed to Northern Ireland Prime Minister James Craig that the 4 men had indeed served in the Ulster Special Constabulary, but claimed that they had been paid off by the Fermanagh USC County Commandant Basil-Brooke shortly after the truce and had not done any duty since. 2 other local loyalists were later forced to paint over the sign reading "Fear God and Honour the King," which adorned the gable end of Aiken's Hotel in the centre of the village. It was allegedly replaced with "Up De Valera." Others were forced to fill sandbags outside the other loyalists were forced to fill sandbags outside the IRA headquarters on Mill Street. From 28th of May until 4th of June, Pettigo's loyalists claimed that Irish soldiers, IRA volunteers, and, quote, their female associates, unquote, engaged in a week-long reign of terror in the area, including assaults against local loyalists, the burning or destruction of loyal emblems such as flags, pictures of the king, and memorials to relatives killed while serving in the British military. The geography of West Fermanagh meant it was almost impossible for the British Army to push back the IRA and elements of the National Army unless units occupied the hills that overlooked Pettigo and the roads that connected Pettigo and Bleak, or Bleak particularly, to the rest of Fermanagh. The British government launched a successful counter-offensive in the Bleak-Pettigo triangle on 4th of June, resulting in 3 IRA fatalities and the death of 1 member of the Ulster Specials. The provisional government quickly came to the agreement with the British and Northern Irish governments that established a neutral zone outside the village of Pettigo, where no person was to be officially armed except soldiers of the British Army. This was quite a conciliatory approach by the provisional government, given the fact that Pettigo was, of course, in the 26 counties. Nonetheless, they accepted that. They accepted the reality of the situation and quickly entered negotiations about the handing back of Pettigo to the provisional government. The officer commanding in Pettigo from June 1922 to January 1923 was Captain Archibald Horndon of the South Staffordshire Regiment, and he quickly established very good relations with Pettigo's loyalists. Horndon drew upon local members of the Ulster Special Constabulary for help in policing his new district. So former USC constables were re-engaged essentially, if indeed, as was claimed by Reverend McKegney, they had sort of left after the truce. They were now used by the South Staffordshire Regiment as a means of for local knowledge, and indeed special constables accompanied the military around the village, including 2 controversially to the Catholic Church, to check the names of those attending Mass in order to identify possible IRA volunteers. The RUC also established a presence on the main Donegal part of Pettigo during the British occupation of the village. By the late summer of 1922, the British government made it clear to Prime Minister James Craig that it would hand back Pettigo to the Free State government. In response to loyalist misgivings, British government representatives insisted on a phased handover, including, if possible, the posting of Protestant soldiers and police officers to Pettigo by the provisional government in Dublin. Reverend McKegney questioned whether the Free State could and would protect Pettigo's loyalist population from the IRA, noting that, quote, if they gave up their arms to defend themselves, they were liable to be shot by the alleged irregulars, who before now chased them from their homes and looted their holdings in June last. Christmas 1922 was a melancholy time in Pettigo. On the evening of 27th of December, the British garrison in Pettigo held a Christmas party for the people of the village, handing out presents to the children. Reverend McKegney and the Presbyterian minister of Pettigo moved and seconded a vote of thanks to the South Staffs. At 9 a.m. on 7th of January, Captain John Joyce and his soldiers of the National Army, together with members of the Civic Guard, moved into the square in Pettigo. A significant number of the new garrison were dispatched from Dublin. A quick handshake and a few words in the main square between Horndon and Joyce marked the formal transfer of authority from the British back to the new provisional government, the new Irish state. The RUC moved to the northern part of the village, setting up their new barracks 60 yards from the National Army garrison. Joyce spoke to the local population, assuring them that, quote, hooliganism would not be tolerated by his men. The British Army noted that those loyalists who had been most active had to leave immediately for Northern Ireland. Loyalists associated with the USC who had resisted the IRA were continuously searched. But despite occasional acts of National Army indiscipline, Joyce's reputation as a fair-minded officer progressively rose among the local Protestant population, who were also impressed with some members of the Civic Guard. The British Army in Fermanagh reported positively on the attitude of Joyce, although they had some reservations about the discipline of the newly recruited soldiers to what was now the National Army. By December 1922, the worst of the violence in Donegal had passed. The National Army was increasingly in the ascendant, and the IRA were reduced to controlling pockets of territory in the west and north of the county. Loyalists, who had initially objected to the presence of both the National Army and the IRA, now moved to a position of covert and sometimes overt support for the former. Except for Pettigo and to some extent Ballintraw, why did a well-armed and reasonably capable paramilitary movement in 1914 not regroup and mobilised to protect Loyalists, or indeed advance the Loyalist cause during the Civil War? Of course, Ulster Unionism was no longer a possible political option for Loyalists in Donegal. So therefore, this was primarily about defence, but nonetheless, during the Civil War, there was significant, large-scale incidents of threats to Loyalist property and indeed occasionally to their lives. So it is curious that they don't remobilise for defensive purposes. There is no single reason for the defanging of Donegal Loyalism. First, as in Monaghan, Loyalists saw itself as acting in support of and occasionally supported by the state. The negotiated removal of British authority disorientated Donegal's Loyalists at a time when they were most vulnerable, early 1922. Unlike in Monaghan, irregular forces moved quickly to take control of large amounts of vacated space left by the RIC, areas like Raphoe and Manor Cunningham, that had been largely uncontested by the IRA during the previous 2 years. Second, the county's most resourceful and capable Loyalist leaders had either left the county, died in the First World War, or were predominantly concerned about the defence of the city of Derry rather than Donegal. A few also simply preferred to focus on their new professions upon demobilisation from the British Army rather than reactivating the UVF. By 1922, Lord Leitrim had emptied Mulroy Castle and moved to his flat in London. Robert Moore was playing an active role in commanding the Ulster Special Constabulary along the border, as well as acting as County Grand Master for the Orange Order in Londonderry. So he was concerned about the interests of Northern Ireland, in which he felt he firmly had a stake, and not least due to his ancestral connections, which were very strong with of course, the city of Derry. The situation in Major Miles's Ballyshannon appears to have been quieter. Here, the National Army was in firmer control and indeed earlier control. Miles, although active in local politics and in regular discussions with pro-treaty leaders, does not appear to have set up any Loyalist defence network in South Donegal. Captain Wagentreiber, although resident in Lifford, seems to have confined himself to business interests across the border in Strabane, County Tyrone. Third, the bulk of the violence against Loyalists occurred in a very short period, between April and the end of June, so before the start of the Civil War. Instead of mobilising a defence thereafter, Loyalists chose to work with stronger entities who offered them protection, namely the British Army in the case of Pettigo and the National Army in the case of Loyalists of Letterkenny and the Lagan area. And indeed, British Army reports from Northern Ireland make clear that they regarded that Loyalists had come to a pragmatic understanding and indeed were helping the National Army assert their authority in various parts of County Donegal. Of course, the treaty also guaranteed a link with the British Crown for the emerging Free State, and indeed a link to the wider empire. A sense of law and order was re-established, and for many Loyalists, that was enough.